All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast, The Robots Are Coming. My name is Ken.
My name is Michael.
And today we have a very special guest, Professor Lemley, professor of law at Stanford Law School and director of the Stanford Program in Law, Science, and Technology. He was a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and as affiliated faculty in the Symbolic Systems program. Could you talk a little bit more about yourself, Professor Lemley?
Sure. I mean, my primary academic focus has been on intellectual property and innovation policy. And I've done a bunch of work on internet law policy, and then more recently, I've been focusing on robotics and artificial intelligence from a legal policy matter.
That sounds great. If you don't know yet, I'm among Ken and I. Ken goes to UC Berkeley, and I go to Stanford. I'm current rising junior here. And you are quite a figure on campus. Your work in IP and in antitrust and law and with SimSys is very well known, and we are very excited and privileged to have you here.
Well, thank you.
So let's introduce our podcast just a bit. So our podcast is called The Robots Are Coming, which by its title basically describes what it is about. And it is on technology's impact on society, especially how the driving force of automation and AI will displace many, many workers, as well as the role that big tech companies play in our society. And because your concentration is in the intersection of IP and antitrust, I think we're very excited to hear your perspective on what big tech companies' role is in society today and what we should do to either regulate or change, or make certain rules to limit their scope of influence. So to start, the first question is very general. Do you think that big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, are utilitarian companies? And what do you think their role in society is?
I think they have all brought enormous benefit to the world. They've transformed the world to such an extent that it's hard to imagine what a world without a Google or an Apple or an Amazon looks like. Right. Some of us lived through those worlds, but it's still, even for us, it's hard to imagine, what that world looks like. That said, I think the thing that has always been great about Silicon Valley and the tech industry is the sort of continuous waves of innovation and of new companies that come around and displace old companies. And it's that kind of new wave of the next thing that has really benefited and driven innovation. And I worry that we're seeing some stagnation in the tech industry. And so it's worth noting that even people talk about kind of how fast moving tech is and innovation and change in Silicon Valley. If you look at the tech incumbents, the youngest of those companies, Facebook, is 15 years old, and lots of them are 20 years old or more. That's remarkable in the history of technology industry. So the question is, where are the companies that we expected to have come around and displaced them, right? Sort of kicked them out, moved to a new business model that in the same way that happened to kind of previous generations of technologies, right? To Yahoo, to Microsoft, to IBM, right? AT&T. You can go back down through a list. So Andrew McCurry and I argue in a paper called Exit Strategy that part of the problem can be traced to the venture capital model that's at the heart of Silicon Valley. So the story of VCs is, we will fund your company, but if you're a venture capitalist, you're interested in an exit strategy. You think when you're starting a company about, how am I going to end it? How am I going to get cash out? How am I going to get paid? And increasingly, I think founders also, because they're getting paid in stock, think about how do I get out? How do I get paid? In the 1980s, 1990s, that was almost always an IPO. You go public, your company is continuing to operate, and everybody cashes out. IPOs have gotten fewer and further between. And so now the way you cash out in Silicon Valley almost always is not by going public, it's by selling out your company. And you are selling out the company increasingly to the incumbents. So I think one of the problems that we've seen is that the Googles and Facebooks and Apples of the world have been dominant, have been able to hold on to their position rather than being displaced by this new insurgent startup, because they're buying up the companies that otherwise would be taking over their position.
Do you think that, like you said, this phenomenon of companies nowadays selling out as a means of exiting is due to the nature, just due to the inherent nature of the internet, of technology, of software, or is it more on man-made institutions like startup accelerators, and like you said, the very specific venture model, this winner-take-all venture model in Silicon Valley?
I do think it is driven by the institutions to a large extent. So I think some of it is a function of law. How easy or hard do we make it to go public and stay in business? Some of it is a function of cash. All of the big tech companies are sitting on ridiculously large piles of cash that they just don't know what to do with. I mean, they buy all the companies they're interested in buying, and they still have hundreds of billions of dollars sitting around. And so that, I think, means that if I've got a startup, I may well be offered quite a lot of money, more money than I would make in the marketplace, to be bought up by the incumbent. Sometimes you're bought up and then shut down. Sometimes you're bought up and then kind of just let to languish a bit, right? Or bought up because they're interested in hiring the talent rather than the technology. So I think all of those can be affected by policy and by deliberate decision. So we can change antitrust policy to make it harder for monopolists to buy up companies. We can change IPO policy to make it easier for companies to get into to stay in business. We could change the way we fund companies, or find other ways for venture capitalists to cash out and get paid without having to sell out the whole company. But we might also need to change the mindset a little bit, right? So that it's the focus goes back to, I want to build something rather than I want an exit, I want to cash out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so in the first antitrust of 1890, they made a distinction between like innocent monopolies, like companies who were good enough to become those monopolies, and differentiated that with other companies that use certain means of like collusion to maintain that status, even when it's not producing innovation. So do you think that fast forward 100-something years, our tech companies, as they are stagnating, like you said, are they becoming what kinds of monopolies are they becoming? And are they still innovating and doing good for society?
Yeah, so I think it's a little complicated, and it may depend a little bit depending on what company we're talking about. So you might feel very differently about an Amazon, for instance, right, which is sort of acquiring larger and larger shares of the market, but it seems to be doing it by actually competing quite aggressively in those markets, right? So it's hard to say they're sitting around doing nothing, right? They're affirmatively trying to deliver more goods to more people. Even the companies, I mean, Google's and Facebook's, I think are, I don't think they acquired their monopoly by sort of collusion or by bad acts. One of the problems with the internet is because it's so strongly driven by network effects, we may naturally tend towards sequential monopolies, right? You don't necessarily want to be on one of 10 competing incompatible social networks, right? You want to be on the social network all your friends are on. So there are natural tendencies that may drive you towards monopoly. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we have in place that sort of disruptive competition, the idea that somebody's going to come along with a better idea and kick you out, and they'll be the new monopolist for a while, and then somebody else will come along and kick them out and be the new monopolist, right? We can end up driving innovation and keeping the market vibrant if those companies are coming. So I think the focus of antitrust really needs to be on making sure that you're not buying up those new startups and shutting them down, making sure that you're not circumventing that next wave of competition. And antitrust, sort of not since 1890, but since 1914, has focused not just on what is your behavior as a monopolist, but it's also restricted your ability to enter into mergers that substantially reduce competition or tend to create a monopoly. And I worry that we haven't been very aggressive in enforcing that merger law in recent years.
I see, and you're very optimistic, it seems, in terms of what we can do around our institutions, actions and policies that we can enforce to create this healthy cycle of disruption, of innovation. So what do you think, what kind of actions do we need to take in order to enforce antitrust the correct way in our current age?
So it's a good question. I mean, I think there are things that the enforcement agencies themselves can do if they just sort of end up with the political will to do it. Some of it is a matter of enforcing existing laws that are already out there. But I think you could also change the laws in ways that that make it easier to bring those actions. So right now, for instance, there's a threshold requirement for reporting a merger. You don't even have to sort of tell the antitrust agencies about it unless the company you're acquiring is worth $200 million or more. And if you buy startups early enough, you can get under that threshold. And so nobody even finds out about it in order to think about whether to challenge it. So I think we could and should change that to make sure that there's more attention paid to any kind of merger by an incumbent. It might make sense to go so far as to say, you know, at least presumptively, if you're a monopolist in a field, you shouldn't be able to buy new companies. We don't that's not we ought to assume that the effect of that is going to be anti-competitive. Maybe you can prove us wrong, right? Maybe you could say, well, this company was going out of business anyway, and so we're the only people who can kind of salvage the products they're making. But that right now the presumption is, yeah, we'll allow the merger unless we can see some strong reasons not to. But at least for tech incumbents, maybe we ought to be reversing that presumption and saying we need to stop consolidating the market.
In your opinion, Professor, is it realistic that competition alone could solve all of the problems for monopolistic competition?
No, I mean, I think, right. So a couple things to note about this idea, right? So one is that, you know, unlike something like I want to break up Apple, I want to break up Google, right? The proposal that we're talking about is something that it's going to operate in the future. It's not going to make anything better right now. It's going to set the stage to allow new companies to come in and challenge and displace these incumbents in the future, but it isn't going to change the way Google or Facebook has dominance, you know, right now. You know, there are people who've said, hey, we need to break them up. I'm a little skeptical of a lot of those, in part because I do think the value or the reason they became monopolists has a lot to do with network effects. So I'm not sure what it would mean to break Facebook into sort of equal parts. You could certainly cut pieces off of the side that were not the central part of the business, right? You could say Instagram or WhatsApp ought to be spun out, kind of be separated from Facebook itself. But I'm not sure it makes sense to say let's just have 3 Googles or 3 Facebooks competing with each other.
And I think a competing idea is from Professor Robert Reich, who says that we're now in the Gilded Age, the new Gilded Age, similar to the first Gilded Age, when the nation's antitrust laws were first enacted. And as then, those with great power and resources are making free market function on their behalf. So, do you think that big tech right now dominate our economy and our politics, and we should take more action in terms of antitrust?
So I do think we should take more action in terms of antitrust. I mean, I think um, so wait, again, one question is, do we need new laws or can we use the laws we've already got?
Mm-hmm.
But another question I think is, do we try to regulate their behavior as opposed to try to break up the companies altogether? And I think that's a hard question. There are advantages to regulation that would allow us to keep some of those network effects. It would allow us to focus on the things that we think are problematic. But our history with regulation hasn't been great. There's a worry that regulators get captured, that kind of companies are better at sort of working around those kinds of regulations. I do think there's definitely going to be some sense in which we want to regulate internet companies, not price regulation necessarily, but whether it's privacy or some other behavior, we might impose greater responsibilities on them because of their greater power. I think part of the problem too is the worry that sort of even something like a structural antitrust remedy is going to be pretty slow. That it's not obvious that it's going to give us greater competition. Our record's mixed. We've had efforts to break up companies that have been, kind of not terribly successful. We've had other efforts that have been extremely successful. So breaking up AT&T basically opened up the telecommunications industry to competition in the 80s and the 1990s. Then we all got dramatic benefits from that. We're speaking across some of that benefit, right? I think there's zero chance that we'd have had real working video conferencing today in a world in which kind of there was one dominant AT&T that was a regulated industry in charge of all of our telecommunications.
Yeah. So you mentioned there's these two approaches. Like one, we continue working with the laws we have. We try to enforce things like privacy, very hot topic issues, especially right now. Seek more revolutionary ideas on the scale of like breaking up at AT&T with these regulation. In terms of maybe perhaps the means of production, it's it's the same way that economists and we can get into a lot of like economic theory, but in terms of today's means of production, it's stuff like computation power, data, AI, which fuels these companies. Do you think that these means of production should be democratized in a sense, or will we trust Google and Facebook with our data and then try to find ways to limit what they can do with it?
So I think this is one of the interesting sort of problems about antitrust in the tech industry is how it intersects with things like privacy. If we, I think a lot of people sort of think of the two as aligned, right? I want, Google has too much of my data. They have too much control over my data. I want that to stop. But here, I think antitrust and privacy law might actually point in opposite directions, right? So if Google is a monopolist with access to your data, they have a lot of data about you, but fewer people have data about you, and they charge higher price for access to that data, right? So if we think about what would it mean to like break them into a bunch of companies, I think you might end up seeing a lot of companies who had access to your data and an incentive to sell your data. They would compete with each other to sell your data more cheaply, right, to more advertisers, That's great from a market competition perspective if we think of digital advertising as the market, but it may be the opposite of what a lot of people want in talking about something like a breakup or to control the power of a Google. So I do think I do think the fact that information is the key feature here does mean there are some things we can do that maybe weren't available if we were talking about breaking up oil companies or telephone companies. So one notable feature, I think, is we could use interoperability as a policy lever. So if you're concerned that Google's self-driving cars are just safer and going to function better because they've had the ability to sort of get more testing, collect more data, et cetera, you could allow or require access to some of that information so that competitors had access to it. If you're concerned about the kind of lack of transparency, I think you could say, well, all right, we're going to require access to how facial recognition software works, for instance, or something of that nature, so that people can try to figure out whether it's causing certain kinds of social problems. Whether we want to do that, I think, depends a little bit on the kind of trade-off I just talked about. That is, do we actually want more people to have access to data, or do we want fewer people to have access to data? I think we get a lot of competitive benefits out of some sort of an interoperability regime, right? So if I could make a social network that could draw from the existing database of a Facebook or an Instagram, right? Allow people to say, okay, I want to move over to this network, but I want to take my friend's network with me. I want to take all of my posts with me. You'd be a lot more likely to see a real competition with a Facebook. You'd see new companies develop. But I think one of the things that means is that you'd be opening a bunch of data to new competitors whose rules we don't know, and so from a privacy perspective, some people are going to have concerns with that.
Yeah, the way I think about this is that as an aspiring AI researcher who studies CS here, there's many sort of layers to how we can encourage competition. Like maybe it's not necessarily breaking up these companies and their storages of user data, but maybe in the AI community, for example, you would have these companies release all these open source tools, and then these machine learning models pre-trained with huge databases. And then people can do like transfer learning on top of those neural networks in order to create their own applications. In some sense, like this does encourage a lot of competition, but it does also feel like we're really just plowing at the surface of a much ocean of trove of data. We can just be plowing and making these marginal improvements on these models, but not actually having access to the real treasure chest. It's a feeling I get a lot as an AI researcher. Like, do you think that's do you think that's the way it should be, or should we try to probe further?
Yeah, so I think, right, and the question is, what level do we open the data, right? I mean, you could say, well, okay, we've built the algorithm, we've trained the algorithm, here's the results, and we'll open that for black box testing or for additional applications. You could imagine other things. You could say, well, okay, we'll give everybody the base algorithm and they can train it on whatever data set they want. That gives you a different level of freedom, but it still requires you to have a big data set you can train on. I mean, you could give access to everything, right? Although I think at some point we do want to have companies have some incentive to build the training data sets to try to differentiate themselves. And it may depend on kind of what application we're talking about. And if the answer is, my car recognizes stop signs better than other people's, I think there's a plausible story that we want everybody to have access to that data at some point, right? That some level of kind of safety data, some level of kind of anti-discrimination or discrimination detection data, right, might be something we feel like everyone should have access to, and that you can build on top of or kind of tweak, but we want everyone to start from a certain base level of technology.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not the only model. If you got a sort of truly competitive AI development system, you could imagine a kind of what I think of as a survivor model, right? So if you got, taking a bunch of different people designing self-driving cars, you could say, all right, you know what? We're only going to approve the sort of best 70%, right? Every year or every 5 years, the ones that are low performers, we pull off the road. Right? We say that's not acceptable. And so each company's now got an incentive independently to try to develop and improve their technology. I think the real question is how much of improvement in AI is going to come from we all work together in the greatest data set, and how much of it's going to come from we got 10 different data sets and 10 completely different approaches, and we'll see which one works. And historically, I think in competition law, the answer is most of the time the latter has been better. Right? Most of the time we've been better off not having kind of one central monopolist who puts a lot of money into R&D, but having a bunch of different incompatible ideas and seeing how they develop. I don't know whether the kind of nature of AI fundamentally changes that, right? Because we need to build on some base level of training data in order to get where we need to go. But that seems to me sort of key to thinking about what market structure do we want and what access rules we want.
Yeah, and there are a variety of ways that we could regulate AI. But moving on from that, how do you think we could regulate the data that a lot of these big tech companies are taking from us? So, for example, based on the California Consumer Privacy Act, which became effective in January 1st of this year, it allowed for comprehensive data ownership and privacy rights. Could we legally exercise our rights under the CCPA?
Yeah, so there's going to be a lot that we're trying to figure out about the CCPA. And so the European equivalent that was loosely based on the GDPR has been around a couple of years longer. But there's still a lot we don't know about that. I mean, I think part of the problem is that in order for you to effectively say, okay, I'm exercising rights of ownership over information about me, you have to have some sense of what knowledge people have and what use they're making of it, and none of that is transparent. But part of the problem, I think, goes in the other direction, right? Which is some of the aspects of these rules are just really hard to square with an AI regime. So one of the rights in the GDPR is a right to a human decision. So it's not like that I have a right to know what information is being collected about me, what use is being made of it, but I have a right to a human decision about various things that affect my life. And I'm just not sure that's feasible in any meaningful sense in a world that is increasingly driven by AI. Right? So you're either going to have a human who looks at the results of the algorithm and says, "Yep, those results are right, and so yes, I bless them," right? Or you're going to have a human who sort of tries to replace or second guess the algorithm. But the less transparent the algorithm is, the more complicated the AI is, the more likely it is we're going to make mistakes if we've got humans second guessing the algorithm. Because they might look at this and say, no, this seems wrong, without kind of fully understanding why the algorithm came to the conclusion it did. So I think one problem with sort of control over your data in the kind of AI world is if it's just sort of piecemeal, right? If I have access or control over some of this data but not others, I might end up sort of, we might end up making worse decisions than we would in a world in which the AI had sort of unrestricted freedom to sort of use all of the information about you.
I think it's very hard to really decipher some of these black box models because they just require quantity over quality, and it's hard to pull them apart and say, at every single layer, this is the information that is being constructed from your data. It's more like, we just stack 100 layers and then train it on as much data as possible. Do you think that this is maybe from like more for our technical audience, something that deserves more research into? Should we like fund more active research into interpretability and deciphering these black box models?
So it's a really hard question. I mean, people very much want explainable AI. They very much want decipherability. Right? They want to be able to understand, right, why the AI came to the conclusion it did. I think increasingly that's going to be something we just need to get over, because I think if AI is going to give us real substantial improvements over what humans can do, it's not just going to be, well, we processed all the same data, but we did it faster, right? It's going to be that it actually sort of finds connections and insights that we didn't find. Right, that one ability of an AI system is to look at this amazing amount of data and to say, well, you know what, actually, right, people who do this thing also do this other thing, right? Or right, I can tell by the way that car is moving, 750 feet ahead, that it's about to do something unexpected that's going to cause me to have to swerve. And if we limit the AI to say, no, we won't let you do something unless you can explain to us in human terms why you did it, I think we're losing some of the potentially greatest benefits of the AI. That said, I think you also kind of want a sanity check. There's some, that maybe, I mean, there are going to be spurious data correlations, right? I mean, that's, the thing about data is, it permits coincidences, right? And so if it turns out that sort of absolutely everyone who engages in the same sort of bad behavior came from Portland, maybe that's because there's something about Portland, but it might just actually be that in this data set that happened, or there's something about the way the data set was given to us that's not complete. And so you want some ability to kind of error check it. Humans maybe can do that. And one benefit of explainable AI, understandable AI, is I can look at it and understand kind of why the AI comes to that conclusion and then judge whether that conclusion is right. But as AI systems get more sophisticated, that's going to be harder and harder to do. And I think there's a greater risk that when the human intervenes and says, no, change this result, they're going to screw something else up, right? That the kind of, data is all interconnected in a way that if you say, oh, just overwrite the algorithm to make sure the car doesn't drive over a kid, right? We're also changing the algorithm in lots of other ways that we don't understand the effects of and that might make things worse. One possible compromise, I think, is not explainable AI, but sort of what you might think of as benchmarked AI. Right? So again, if we've got a number of different algorithms trying different approaches, right, to the extent that they come from different approaches but end up converging on a similar conclusion, we might be more comfortable that that conclusion is robust, that it's not just an artifact of the data or the way we program the algorithm. So that too kind of argues for having sort of not just one big database that everyone has access to and uses, but maybe kind of some amount of seeding that everybody has, but then people building their own somewhat incompatible databases to try to get those different approaches.
That's really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so with all of these advancements with AI and algorithms, we're on the verge of a new wave of mobile health apps measuring everything from your cholesterol to blood pressure. And in the coming years, software apps will be doing a lot of the things that physicians would do, or even radiologists would be able to do. So do you think that we should somehow change the way that our economic model is measured, such as some form of redistributive tax or some kind of that, to ensure that a lot of these breakthrough technologies could, you know, help out the rest of us, and help for the future economy of work?
So yeah, I do think that's going to be an increasingly important issue, and not just kind of in health, but right across all sorts of areas, right? Whether it's self-driving cars and trucks, right, or a variety of other things. Um, one of the things that AI, threatens to do or promises to do, depending on one's perspective, is displace a lot of work that's currently done by human beings. And you can do it more efficiently, and that's great. But you do have to worry about the transition costs of a bunch of human beings who are now out of work. So, people have various responses to this. I mean, I think, one thing you could say is, great, you know what, we all have access to everything gets cheaper, right? A self-driving car that doesn't actually have much in the way of marginal costs of being on the road can get you where you need to go a lot cheaper than a car that's got to have a driver who's got to get paid. So yeah, people are losing jobs, but everybody's getting better stuff cheaper. And the real problem then, I think, is, as you suggest, right, how do we make sure that the kind of distribution of the benefits sort of maps in some way to the distribution of the costs? And this is, I think, one of the things that, right, our economy used to be better at doing and is getting worse at doing. And it's one of the things that the dominance of a few tech firms, right, is maybe exacerbating, right? So what we want to make sure does not happen is, right, everything gets somewhat cheaper. All of the money goes to Amazon's self-shipping trucks or to Google's self-driving cars, and there are a bunch of people out of work who can't afford much, while the rich get richer. There's of course a lot of political debate about, right, what you do about that, where how you resolve it. But I do think one of the things that we're going to need to do as a society is find ways to make sure that those advances get distributed to everybody, but also that the economic growth that they generate isn't limited to the 1% or the 1% of the 1%, right? But that's distributed, whether it's in the form of actual cash distribution, I guess, is less important to me, right, than is it sort of plowed back into society in a way that benefits all of us, right? Is it put into infrastructure to build roads and rebuild cities? Is it put into kind of giving healthcare access to people who wouldn't otherwise have access to it? I think there are ways to take that wealth and do socially useful things with it, whether or not we're sort of literally redistributing money from one person to another.
Yeah, and I think from your response, very inspiring speech just now, I think I heard a mix of Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, two of
Yeah.
the politicians this past election cycle that have proposed a lot of these redistribution plans and solutions to these problems. What are your thoughts on these two politicians, on the conversations being had in the political arena? And, is there maybe a gap between the understanding of those politicians and those in Silicon Valley, and how can we bridge that?
Yeah, so I do think there is a gap there. I guess one of the odd things about the current political situation is it's so overshadowed by the, frankly, craziness of the sort of current administration and the current situation, right? That the conversation that we ought to be having as a nation in some sort of broader sense, it gets eclipsed by what crazy thing did Donald Trump do today, right? And so I think on the Democratic side, a lot of the conversation then became about, well, sort of like, how can we just make sure that Donald Trump is gone? And we put off, I think, a lot of the harder conversations that need to be had about, right, to what extent are we gonna try to bring back the the world, and not just the world of an America, right? Even an America that we think of historically in conservative terms, right? You think America in the 1950s, right? There were lots of inequalities in American society in the 1950s, but we had a marginal tax rate that was 90% at the top. Right, people who made a lot of money paid 90% of it to the government, and we invested a lot of in infrastructure. Right, we invested in expanding healthcare and so forth. And so, yeah, I do think I think those are conversations we're going to have, and whether it's Silicon Valley or Wall Street, the folks who have been winners in the kind of last 30 years of the economy, if they want our country and our economy to survive, I think are going to have to recognize that there's a certain amount of giving back that needs to happen to try to make sure that everybody in America feels like they're part of the same enterprise. Because I think the problem right now is people don't feel that way. And a lot of the social strife that we're seeing, whether it's from the right wing or from the left wing, right, is a feeling like, it used to be the case that a rising tide lifts all boats, but that's not how any of us feel right now. And if we don't get back to feeling that way, it's really hard to have a society function.
And I definitely agree. I think we need to feel like we're all shareholders in the richest economy in the history of the world. And right now we're seeing a lot of those benefits and profit going to just very, very selective places, basically in just Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And the rest of the country, you talk about like truck drivers in Iowa, the call center workers, what are their next moves after this wave of automation sweeps across the current economy. And
right.
Yeah, and those are definitely the conversations we should be having instead of, what did Donald Trump do? And right. I think we're in this sort of, we are definitely in a pretty unique situation. It's very unprecedented for sure. Yeah. And I think with that, we'll like to end this episode. Are there any lasting words you want to speak to our audience?
No, this was a great conversation, and thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Great.